Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be doing a short review of Middlegame by Seanan McGuire. I mentioned this in my mid-month May wrap-up video that I just did. I had kind of mixed feelings about this book, so this review might be a little bit on the shorter side. Normally I'd rather talk about a book that I had really strong feelings about, and in this one there are things that I like and things that I didn't like as much. Overall, I found a lot of good in it, but I'm not sure if it's a book that I would have normally chosen to review. However, it is a Hugo Awards finalist this year, and I've made it my goal to read and review all of the books on that list, so I'm going to go ahead and do a review of Middlegame today. Middlegame was the first book by Seanan McGuire that I've ever read. I know she's actually written quite a lot. I think a lot of it is urban fantasy, and I've mentioned a couple times already, I'm really curious how close this book is in terms of style to her other writing, because overall I really enjoyed the writing style, and it's hard to see how this writing style would come across in a slightly different genre. She does have a series that's a finalist for this year's Hugo Award for Best Series, so maybe I'll go ahead and check out a book from that series next month. So Middlegame is kind of a confusing book, and she does mention in the acknowledgments at the end of the book that originally she did a 4-page spec proposal for her agent, and her agent completely didn't understand what the book was supposed to be about, and so she just went ahead and wrote the book anyway to sort of prove her point. And having read the book, I can completely understand why that 4-page proposal was probably pretty confusing, because this book is not easy to understand or easy to explain what it's about. Going into the book, I had a hard time understanding what it was about from reading the cover copy or any descriptions of it, and now that I've read it, I have to say that just reading the description on the back of the book really gives you zero impression of what the book is going to be like or what the plot is about. And even now that I've read the whole thing and I enjoyed it, it's kind of hard to describe. And by the way, I really don't mean anything against the author when I complain about the cover copy being confusing. As far as I know, the back cover materials, all that stuff, the author has minimal to no input on what goes onto that. That's more of a marketing decision. So I'm not blaming her for the fact that I didn't understand what the book was going to be like when I went into it. There were about 3 prologues to this book before it actually got to the main story. First, it started out with a kind of flash forward, then there was a flashback to 100 years earlier, then there was a setup with the main antagonist, and it was only after that that we actually got to what I would call the main storyline of the book. Even Way of Kings, which is Brandon Sanderson's first book in the Stormlight Archive, which is supposed to be an epic 10-book fantasy series, that had only 2 prologues. Well, it had a prelude and a prologue, and he said he was worried about that being too much prologue. So I really feel like for Middlegame, there needed to be a way to get it across without too much setup. As it was, I found I wasn't too into it until about a third of the way through the book, and at that point I got very invested in the characters, and I really started caring a lot what happened, and I was pretty much glued to the book until the end. It's essentially contemporary fantasy. It's set in the modern day, and the 2 main characters are Roger and Dodger, who are twins. They have been created through alchemy, and they were separated at birth. They are psychically connected, but are being kept apart until they get older due to a nefarious alchemical plot. So the emotional center of the story is the ways that they hurt each other but also need each other and eventually manage to grow together. Like I mentioned, I would say that by about a third of the way through the book, I found myself really attached to both characters and caring a lot about them and what happened. And I would say that by about halfway through the book, I was pretty hooked and really wanted to find out what happened next. While the character arc was really powerful and held my attention, it was also pretty repetitive at certain points in the book. I felt like there were a lot of iterations of them sort of refinding each other and then getting torn apart again, and there were plot reasons why that was the case, but even so, it got a little tiresome to read about at certain points in the book. But even though it was repetitive and I was sort of sick of that motif happening, I still cared a lot about it while it was happening, and it didn't really make me want to put down the book at any point. Also, with that recurring idea, I felt like in the end it did kind of get resolved more by the plot than by emotional development from within the characters. So maybe that's fine, but I think it could have been resolved a little bit differently. Another thing that happened throughout the book was that we got to see glimpses of the villain and his team and what was going on and what the plot was. And this was honestly more of an excuse to show us what was happening behind the scenes and give us a little more context for what was happening to Roger and Dodger and why the villain himself wasn't an especially deep or important character. There were a lot of elements of the plot that got revealed and explained very slowly throughout the entire course of the book, including what that flash forward prologue was about that became sort of a recurring frame to the story. And it's a very long way through it until you understand why you're seeing this. For me, the way we received information as the book progressed and how it concluded made Middlegame, I would say, about 75% satisfying as a reader. I actually really love confusing books. I don't mind getting thrown into something I completely don't understand, but it's really important to me for there to be a payoff at the end for why we were confused and that I could go back and understand everything that was happening and what was there and really dig into it. And for this book, there's a lot that just doesn't get explained or is never really stops being confusing. So in that way, I just couldn't find it entirely satisfying. And somebody that doesn't care as much about things clicking into place and having that aha moment where it actually makes sense, they might not care about this at all. Some of my favorite books of all time are books that are very confusing in the beginning and we learn more and more about the world and what's going on as we progress. But I missed having that kind of aha moment in this book. Like when things got explained, it was more of a, okay, cool, like I'm happy I know that now, that's fun, or something like that, rather than really feeling deeply satisfied. I have to wonder if Seanan McGuire was just maybe a little bit too in love with her concept here. I could sort of feel her maybe enjoying it a little too much. And that's something as a reader, you don't want to feel like the author is so in love with their book that you as a reader don't get to love it as much as they do. Basically, I think if she had managed to make me understand how the magic and concepts behind it worked just a little bit more and given a little more payoff, all the things that were confusing about this book would have really been rewarding in the end. It's kind of too bad because for me, if things had been done a little bit differently, I think this could have been like a mind-blowingly good book. And then for me, the way it turned out to be a little more of just a solid book. I'm not going to be running around recommending it to my friends, but I did really enjoy it, and I thought her writing was beautiful. I thought the characters and the way she captured them and their emotions and their story was really strong, and there was just really a lot to enjoy here. I definitely wouldn't discourage anyone from picking up this book. There was one secondary character in this book that was more of a morally gray character. I think that I was supposed to like them a lot more than I did, or at least believe that the characters would have really cared about them. So I think the ending would have been more effective for me in the way that everything resolved if that character in particular had been someone that I cared about more. And in general, I felt like the ending could have been more fleshed out. I felt like maybe she wasn't quite sure where the story needed to end. But those things aside, I read this book in about a day, and for about 2/3 of it, I was totally hooked and couldn't put it down. So overall, it was really a good reading experience. It had characters that I felt attached to, a pretty smart plot, and there's a lot to enjoy here. It just didn't come together into a cohesive, really good whole for me. So for those of you that really like Seanan McGuire, what are her best books? What series would you recommend? I think I've asked this a few times already, but I really enjoyed the writing enough that I'd be very interested to pick up more books by her. Let me know down in the comments if you have any recommendations for books by Seanan McGuire, or if you read this book, what did you think about it? I feel like my opinion here is very personal. I think that some of the things that bothered me, somebody else might not care about at all and might really love this book. If you enjoyed this, please hit the like button and go ahead and subscribe if you'd like to see more videos from me.